The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as Commander Jackson reviewed the mission briefings one final time. His weathered hands traced the route on the tactical map, marking each checkpoint with the precision of a man who had led countless operations. At 42, Jackson had seen enough combat to know that no plan survived first contact with the enemy, but preparation remained his sacred ritual. His unit consisted of 18 elite soldiers, each handpicked for their specialized skills. Among them was Corporal Sarah Chen, the unit's field medic, whose steady hands had saved more lives than Jackson could count. Chen had joined the military straight out of medical school, trading a comfortable civilian practice for the adrenaline and purpose of battlefield medicine. Her colleagues often joked that she could perform surgery in a hurricane, but Jackson had seen her work under actual fire and knew it wasn't an exaggeration. The mission seemed straightforward on paper. Intelligence reports indicated that a small, terrorist cell had established a weapons cache in an abandoned factory complex 20 miles east of their position. The building had been empty for years, a relic of better economic times now serving as a perfect hiding spot for extremists. Local informants suggested minimal resistance, perhaps 3 or 4 militants at most. Jackson's team would conduct a swift raid, secure the weapons, and extract before dawn. As the team gathered for final equipment checks, Jackson noticed the usual pre-mission tension. Veterans like Sergeant Martinez cleaned their weapons with mechanical precision, while newer recruits like Private Thompson fidgeted with their gear. Chen moved between the soldiers, checking medical supplies and reminding each one about the location of their individual first aid kits. She had a way of calming nervous soldiers with her quiet confidence and gentle humor. The convoy of 3 armored vehicles departed the base at 0300 hours, their engines rumbling through the pre-dawn darkness. Jackson rode in the lead vehicle, studying satellite images on his tablet while maintaining radio contact with headquarters. The intelligence seemed solid, but something nagged at him. The informant's information had come too easily, the details too precise. In his experience, real intelligence was messy and incomplete, not the neat package they'd been handed. Chen sat across from him in the cramped vehicle, organizing her medical kit for the 3rd time. She caught his concerned expression and offered a reassuring smile. "Just another day at the office, Commander," she said, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. Jackson nodded, but his unease continued to grow. The closer they got to the target, the more his instincts screamed that something was wrong. The factory complex loomed ahead in the darkness, a maze of abandoned buildings and rusted machinery. Jackson's team moved with practiced efficiency, establishing a perimeter and identifying entry points. The main building stood 4 stories tall, its broken windows like dead eyes staring into the night. Thermal imaging showed minimal heat signatures, confirming the intelligence reports of light enemy presence. As they approached the entry point, Chen checked her medical supplies one final time. Her kit contained enough supplies to treat multiple casualties, from combat gauze and tourniquets to more advanced surgical tools. She had learned long ago that being overprepared was the difference between life and death in the field. The weight of responsibility for her team's lives rested heavily on her shoulders, but she had never let that burden show. Jackson gave the signal, and his team breached the building with swift precision. The first floor appeared empty, filled only with abandoned machinery and years of accumulated debris. Their boots echoed in the vast space as they methodically cleared each room. The thermal readings had been accurate so far, but Jackson's unease continued to intensify with each empty corridor they encountered. The second floor yielded similar results, though they found evidence of recent activity. Cigarette butts, food, containers, and sleeping areas suggested that the building had indeed been used as a hideout. Chen documented everything with her camera while maintaining security protocols. The team's movements were coordinated and professional, each soldier knowing their role without need for excessive communication. It wasn't until they reached the 3rd floor that everything went catastrophically wrong. As Jackson's point man rounded a corner, the building erupted in automatic weapons fire. The abandoned factory had been transformed into an elaborate trap, with hidden firing positions and reinforced barriers turning each hallway into a killing field. Jackson's team found themselves caught in a crossfire that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. The intelligence had been completely wrong, or worse, deliberately falsified. Instead of 3 or 4 militants, Jackson estimated at least 30 enemy combatants based on the volume of incoming fire. His team was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in an unfamiliar building with limited escape routes. The carefully planned mission had become a desperate fight for survival in a matter of seconds. Chen immediately took cover behind an overturned table and began calling out to assess casualties. 2 soldiers were down in the initial exchange, and she could hear others calling for medical assistance over the chaos of gunfire. The building's layout worked against them, with narrow corridors and multiple levels providing perfect positions for ambush. Jackson realized they had walked directly into a carefully orchestrated trap. As bullets shattered concrete around them, Jackson made the hardest decision of his military career. He ordered his team to fall back to defensible positions while he attempted to coordinate an escape route. But the enemy had anticipated this response, sealing off the obvious exit points with concentrated fire. The factory had become a death trap, and Jackson's 18 soldiers were caught in its steel and concrete jaws. The sound of gunfire echoed through the building like thunder, punctuated by the shouts of his men and the crash of falling debris. Chen was already moving between wounded soldiers, her medical training taking over despite the chaos surrounding them. Jackson realized that their survival would depend not on firepower or tactics, but on the courage and skill of every individual member of his team, especially the quiet medic who had just become their only hope of making it home alive. The factory had transformed into a concrete nightmare where every shadow could hide an enemy gunman. Chen crawled from wounded soldier to wounded soldier, her medical bag bouncing against her back as bullets whined overhead. Private Thompson had taken shrapnel to his leg from a grenade explosion, while Sergeant Martinez clutched his shoulder where a rifle round had torn through his body armor. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic taste of fear that filled every breath. Jackson pressed himself against a concrete pillar, trying to establish radio contact with headquarters while coordinating his team's defensive positions. The enemy had clearly studied their tactics, positioning themselves to cut off standard escape routes and communication protocols. Every time his soldiers attempted to advance or retreat, concentrated fire forced them back into increasingly desperate positions. The carefully planned mission had become an exercise in pure survival. Chen reached Thompson first, her hands already working before her eyes fully assessed the damage. The shrapnel had severed an artery in his thigh, and blood was spreading across the dusty floor in an expanding pool. She applied pressure with one hand, while reaching for a tourniquet with the other, her movements automatic despite the chaos surrounding them. Thompson's face had gone pale, but his eyes remained focused on her face as she worked to save his life. The enemy fighters moved through the building with disturbing coordination, suggesting extensive preparation and training. They used the factory's layout to their advantage, firing from elevated positions and then disappearing into the maze of machinery and abandoned offices. Jackson realized they weren't dealing with a small terrorist cell, but a well-equipped force that had turned the building into a fortress designed specifically to trap and eliminate military units. Martinez's shoulder wound was bleeding heavily, but the bullet had passed through muscle without hitting major organs or arteries. Chen worked quickly to pack the wound with combat gauze while he continued returning fire with his good arm. The sergeant's determination impressed her, even as she worried about blood loss and the possibility of infection in the contaminated environment. Every decision carried life or death consequences, and there was no time for second-guessing. Jackson's attempts to coordinate an organized retreat were frustrated by the enemy's tactical superiority. They had positioned machine gun nests to cover every possible exit route, while snipers on the upper floors picked off anyone who exposed themselves for more than a few seconds. His team was trapped in what military strategists called a kill box, with nowhere to run and insufficient firepower to fight their way out through conventional means. The building's industrial layout created a deadly maze of blind corners and concealed positions. Chen had to navigate this labyrinth while carrying medical supplies and treating casualties under constant threat of enemy fire. She developed an almost supernatural awareness of bullet trajectories and explosion patterns, anticipating danger seconds before it materialized. Her medical training had never included combat survival skills, but necessity was proving to be an excellent teacher. Communications with headquarters remained spotty due to the building's steel structure and possible enemy jamming equipment. Jackson managed to transmit brief status reports, but coordinating air support or reinforcement seemed impossible given their precarious position. His team was effectively cut off from outside assistance, forced to rely entirely on their own resources and training to survive the next few hours. Private Williams took a sniper's bullet to his chest while attempting to provide covering fire for Chen's medical work. The impact knocked him backward behind a concrete barrier, where Chen found him struggling to breathe as blood filled his lungs. She immediately recognized the symptoms of a tension pneumothorax and knew she had only minutes to relieve the pressure before Williams suffocated on his own blood. Working with hands that remained steady despite the gunfire, she inserted a needle between his ribs to release the trapped air. The enemy's tactical patience impressed and terrified Jackson in equal measure. They weren't rushing forward in suicidal charges, but maintaining disciplined fire positions while gradually tightening their tactical noose. Professional soldiers would have been difficult enough to fight under these conditions, but these opponents demonstrated training and equipment that suggested backing from a major military organization rather than a simple terrorist cell. Chen's medical supplies were running dangerously low as more soldiers sustained injuries from the sustained firefight. She had already used most of her combat gauze and was down to her last 2 tourniquets. Every medical decision required careful consideration of resource allocation, forcing her to prioritize injuries based on survivability rather than severity. The emotional weight of these choices pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Jackson watched his medic work with growing admiration and concern. Chen was exposing herself to enemy fire with each movement between casualties, but she never hesitated or showed fear. Her calm presence seemed to steady the entire unit, giving wounded soldiers hope while inspiring the uninjured to fight harder. She had become the spiritual center of their desperate defense, though Jackson worried about how long she could maintain such heroic efforts. The factory's 4th floor remained largely unexplored, but thermal imaging suggested it contained the heaviest concentration of enemy fighters. Jackson knew that any escape attempt would require clearing those positions, but his reduced force lacked the manpower for a successful assault. They were trapped between the enemy above and limited escape routes below, with their ammunition, supplies dwindling and casualties mounting by the hour. As evening approached, Jackson realized they were facing a siege rather than a typical firefight. The enemy had superior numbers, better positions, and apparently unlimited ammunition supplies. His team's survival would depend on their ability to outlast the enemy's patience or find some tactical advantage that could turn the tide of battle. With Chen working tirelessly to keep his wounded soldiers alive, Jackson began formulating increasingly desperate plans for escape. The concrete walls that had seemed like protection now felt like prison bars, trapping his team in a killing field, where every breath might be their last. But as he watched Chen bandage another wounded soldier while bullets chipped concrete inches from her head, Jackson felt a surge of pride in his unit's courage and determination. They might be outnumbered and outgunned, but they were far from defeated. As darkness settled over the factory complex, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Jackson's ammunition count revealed a sobering reality that his team had perhaps 2 hours of sustained fighting capability remaining. The enemy seemed to possess unlimited supplies, sending probing attacks every 30 minutes to test their defensive positions and gradually wear down their resistance. Chen had transformed a corner of the 2nd floor into a makeshift medical station, where 6 wounded soldiers lay in various states of injury. The enemy's psychological warfare proved almost as effective as their bullets. They used loudspeakers to taunt Jackson's team in accented English, describing exactly how they would be tortured and executed once ammunition ran out. These broadcasts were interspersed with recorded screams and gunshots, designed to break down morale and encourage surrender. Jackson ordered his soldiers to ignore the propaganda, but he could see the strain showing in their faces as hope began to fade. Chen worked by the light of a small tactical flashlight, treating injuries that would have challenged a fully equipped hospital emergency room. Corporal Davis had suffered severe burns from an incendiary grenade, requiring constant attention to prevent infection and manage pain. Private Johnson's broken leg needed splinting and elevation, while Sergeant Brooks had taken shrapnel to his abdomen that required careful monitoring for signs of internal bleeding. Each patient demanded her full attention, yet she somehow managed to care for all 6 simultaneously. Jackson attempted to establish communication with air support, but enemy jamming equipment continued to interfere with their radio frequencies. He managed to send brief status updates using encrypted burst transmissions, but coordinating rescue operations remained impossible. The factory's steel construction and the enemy's electronic warfare capabilities had effectively isolated his team from outside assistance. They were truly on their own in this concrete tomb. The building's industrial infrastructure began working against them in unexpected ways. Enemy fighters had apparently spent weeks preparing the facility, rigging explosive devices and creating hidden passages through the machinery. What had seemed like random equipment placement now revealed itself as carefully constructed firing positions and escape routes that gave the enemy significant tactical advantages over Jackson's trapped soldiers. Chen's medical supplies reached critical levels as the night wore on. She had used her last tourniquet on Private Collins, whose leg had been nearly severed by machine gun fire. Her combat gauze was gone, forcing her to improvise bandages from torn clothing and equipment straps. The morphine had run out hours ago, leaving her with only basic painkillers to manage the agony of soldiers with severe injuries. Every medical decision became a desperate gamble with limited resources. The factory's heating system had been damaged in the firefight, and temperatures were dropping rapidly as the night progressed. Hypothermia became an additional threat for Jackson's wounded soldiers, who were losing body heat through their injuries and shock. Chen used emergency blankets and shared body heat to keep her patients stable, but she knew that prolonged exposure to the cold could prove as deadly as enemy bullets. Jackson's tactical options continued to shrink as enemy pressure intensified. The fourth-floor snipers had established overlapping fields of fire that made movement between their defensive positions extremely dangerous. Any attempt to reach the ground floor would require crossing open areas where his soldiers would be completely exposed to enemy observation and fire. The building had become a 3-dimensional maze designed to channel his movements into predetermined kill zones. Despite the overwhelming odds, Chen never lost her focus on saving lives. She had improvised stretchers from machinery and moved all the wounded soldiers to a more defensible position near the building's central stairwell. This location offered better protection from enemy fire while maintaining access to multiple escape routes if the opportunity arose. Her tactical thinking impressed Jackson, who realized that medical training had given her a unique perspective on battlefield survival. The enemy launched their most coordinated attack yet at approximately 200 hours, using explosive charges to breach their defensive positions from multiple directions simultaneously. Jackson's team found themselves fighting in 3 dimensions, as enemy soldiers appeared from hidden passages in previously secured areas. The factory's complex layout allowed attackers to emerge from unexpected angles, turning every shadow into a potential threat. Chen continued treating casualties, even as the battle raged around her medical station. Sergeant Martinez had developed signs of infection in his shoulder wound, requiring immediate attention despite the ongoing firefight. She administered antibiotics from her dwindling supplies while using her own body to shield him from flying debris and ricocheting bullets. Her courage under fire inspired Jackson's entire team to fight harder despite their desperate circumstances. The enemy's ammunition supplies seemed endless, suggesting a well-established supply line that had been months in the making. Jackson realized they weren't facing a spontaneous ambush, but a carefully planned operation designed to eliminate his specific unit. The intelligence failure that had led them into this trap now seemed like deliberate sabotage rather than simple incompetence. Someone had wanted his team in this exact location at this exact time. As dawn approached, Jackson's soldiers were running on pure adrenaline and determination. Most had sustained minor injuries from flying debris and ricocheting bullets, while fatigue was affecting their accuracy and reaction times. Chen had been working continuously for over 6 hours, treating wounds and monitoring casualties while remaining alert for incoming threats. Her stamina and dedication seemed almost superhuman under the circumstances. The factory's structure began showing serious damage from the prolonged firefight. Concrete walls were cracking under repeated impacts, and several support pillars showed dangerous stress fractures. Jackson realized that the building itself was becoming unstable, creating the possibility of structural collapse that could bury his entire team under tons of debris. The enemy's heavy weapons were literally destroying their shelter around them. Chen made a decision that would define the rest of the battle. Recognizing that their current position was becoming untenable, she began planning an evacuation of all wounded soldiers to a more secure location deeper in the building. This would require exposing herself and her patients to concentrated enemy fire, but staying in their current position meant certain death when the damaged structure eventually collapsed. Her medical oath to do no harm was about to collide with the harsh realities of combat survival. Chen's evacuation plan required moving 6 severely wounded soldiers through a gauntlet of enemy fire to reach a more stable section of the building. She had identified a route through the factory's basement level that offered some protection from the snipers above, but it meant navigating through complete darkness with minimal lighting. Jackson initially refused to approve such a dangerous mission, but the growing instability of their current position left no alternative choices. The basement evacuation began at 0430 hours, with Chen leading the way, using night vision equipment borrowed from one of the scouts. She moved with extraordinary stealth through the underground passages, pausing frequently to listen for enemy movement while checking on her patients. The wounded soldiers bit down on pieces of cloth to prevent their groans of pain from revealing their position to nearby enemy fighters. Private Thompson, despite his severe leg injury, insisted on helping carry other wounded soldiers during the evacuation. Chen had to remind him repeatedly to conserve his strength and avoid reopening his arterial repair. But his determination to help his fellow soldiers proved impossible to discourage. His courage inspired the other wounded men to push through their own pain and contribute to the group's survival efforts. The basement level revealed evidence of extensive enemy preparation that chilled Jackson's blood. Weapons caches, communication equipment, and sleeping areas suggested that dozens of fighters had been living in the factory for weeks before the ambush. Maps on the walls showed detailed knowledge of his unit's standard operating procedures and typical mission profiles. This wasn't random terrorism, but a sophisticated military operation targeting his specific team. Chen's medical skills proved invaluable in navigating the dark underground passages. Her knowledge of human anatomy helped her move wounded soldiers without causing additional injuries, while her understanding of shock and blood loss allowed her to prioritize patients who needed immediate attention versus those who could wait. She had essentially become a triage nurse in a combat zone, making life and death decisions with insufficient information and resources. The enemy had anticipated the possibility of basement movement, positioning explosive devices along the most obvious routes. Chen's careful reconnaissance discovered several improvised explosive devices that would have killed her entire group of wounded soldiers. She marked these locations and found alternate passages, adding precious time to their evacuation, but keeping everyone alive through her meticulous attention to detail. Jackson coordinated covering fire from the upper floors, while Chen moved the wounded through the basement. His remaining mobile soldiers were running critically low on ammunition, but they maintained steady pressure on enemy positions to prevent pursuit of the evacuation group. Every bullet had to count, as there would be no resupply until they either escaped or died trying. The factory's basement connected to an adjacent building through a series of maintenance tunnels that the enemy had apparently overlooked in their preparations. Chen discovered this escape route while searching for a secure location to treat her patients. The tunnels were narrow and partially flooded, but they offered the first real hope of evacuation that Jackson's team had experienced since the ambush began. Chen's leadership skills emerged during the basement evacuation as she organized the wounded soldiers into an effective support network. Those with minor injuries helped carry those with severe wounds, while everyone contributed to security and navigation duties according to their capabilities. She had transformed a group of casualties into a functional unit capable of independent movement and self-defense. The adjacent building proved to be an abandoned office complex with multiple exit points and better defensive positions. Chen established a new medical station in a conference room while Jackson's mobile soldiers secured the perimeter and established communication with the outside world. For the first time in nearly 8 hours, His team had a defensible position with multiple escape routes available. Chen's medical assessment revealed the true cost of their ordeal. 3 soldiers had life-threatening injuries requiring immediate hospital treatment, while 2 others needed surgery within the next few hours to prevent permanent disability. Her field medical work had kept everyone alive, but several patients were reaching the limits of what battlefield medicine could accomplish without proper facilities and equipment. Jackson finally managed to establish clear radio contact with headquarters using the office building's elevated position and reduced enemy jamming. Air support was inbound, but the rescue helicopters would need a secured landing zone that his reduced force might not be able to provide. The enemy had undoubtedly discovered their escape and would be organizing pursuit operations to prevent their evacuation. The enemy's response to their escape proved swift and overwhelming. Within 30 minutes of reaching the office building, Jackson's team found themselves surrounded once again by superior numbers with heavy weapons. The brief respite had allowed Chen to stabilize her patients and resupply her medical kit from abandoned first aid stations, but their tactical situation remained desperate. Chen made another crucial decision that would define the remainder of their survival struggle. Recognizing that the wounded soldiers were slowing down the entire group and preventing effective defensive maneuvering, she volunteered to remain behind with the casualties while Jackson's mobile soldiers attempted to break through enemy lines and establish a landing zone for rescue helicopters. Jackson absolutely refused to abandon his medic and wounded soldiers, but Chen's logic was undeniable. The enemy wanted to capture or kill the entire unit, but they were primarily interested in the mobile soldiers who posed the greatest threat to their operation. By splitting the group, they could create confusion and potentially save more lives through strategic sacrifice rather than futile heroics. The office building's construction offered better defensive possibilities than the factory, but enemy forces were already positioning heavy weapons to blast through the walls and eliminate any resistance. Chen knew that her medical station would become a target once the assault began, but she had made her choice to stay with soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. Her oath as a medic demanded that she remain with those who needed her most. Jackson's mobile soldiers prepared for what might be their final battle, knowing that their sacrifice could provide enough distraction for Chen to keep the wounded alive until rescue arrived. The bond between these soldiers had been forged through shared danger and mutual dependence, creating a brotherhood that transcended normal military relationships. They would rather die fighting than abandon their comrades to enemy brutality. As sunrise approached, Chen organized her wounded soldiers into defensive positions around the medical station, while Jackson's mobile unit prepared to engage the enemy in a desperate delaying action. The next few hours would determine whether her courage and medical skills had been enough to save the lives entrusted to her care, or whether they would all die together in this concrete tomb far from home. The final assault began with a coordinated artillery barrage that shook the office building to its foundations. Jackson's mobile soldiers took positions at strategic windows and stairwells, preparing to sell their lives as dearly as possible, while Chen fortified her medical station in the building's central core. The wounded soldiers who could still handle weapons formed a defensive circle around their medic, determined to protect the woman who had saved their lives. Chen worked frantically to prepare her patients for what might be their final battle. She distributed the remaining painkillers to those who could still fight, while applying pressure dressings and tourniquets to minimize bleeding from reopened wounds. Private Thompson, despite his severe leg injury, insisted on manning a defensive position with his rifle, his determination inspiring the other wounded soldiers to ignore their own pain and focus on survival. Jackson's tactical radio crackled, with updates from approaching rescue helicopters, but enemy surface-to-air missiles had created a deadly gauntlet that prevented immediate evacuation. The pilots reported heavy ground fire and organized resistance that suggested enemy reinforcements had arrived during the night. His team's escape window was rapidly closing as superior enemy numbers surrounded the office building. The first wave of enemy infantry breached the ground floor using explosive charges and sustained automatic weapons fire. Jackson's soldiers responded with disciplined aimed fire that dropped several attackers, but their ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted after the prolonged firefight. Every shot had to count, as there would be no opportunity for resupply. Before the enemy overwhelmed their positions, Chen's medical station became a fortress within a fortress as wounded soldiers created interlocking fields of fire around her makeshift treatment area. Sergeant Martinez, despite his infected shoulder wound, coordinated their defense with professional skill, while Chen continued treating patients under increasingly desperate conditions. The sound of approaching enemy footsteps echoed through the building's corridors like a death march. Enemy fighters reached the second floor using tactical precision that impressed Jackson despite the deadly circumstances. They moved with covering fire and coordinated advances that suggested extensive training and battlefield experience. His outnumbered soldiers were facing professional military units rather than irregular terrorists, explaining the sophistication of their tactics and equipment throughout the prolonged engagement. Jackson made the hardest decision of his military career, ordering his mobile soldiers to conduct a fighting withdrawal that would draw enemy attention away from Chen's medical station. This meant abandoning defensive positions and accepting higher casualties in exchange for giving the wounded soldiers a chance to survive until rescue arrived. The brotherhood forged through shared combat made every step of this retreat an agony of divided loyalty. Chen realized that Jackson's sacrifice was creating an opportunity for her own desperate gambit. While enemy attention focused on pursuing his mobile unit, she began organizing an evacuation of her wounded soldiers through the building's service elevator shaft. This route would be dangerous and painful for injured men, but it offered their only hope of reaching the roof where rescue helicopters might be able to extract them. The elevator shaft evacuation required lifting severely wounded soldiers through multiple floors using improvised rope systems and shared physical effort. Chen went first to secure each level, followed by the wounded soldiers who helped each other despite their own injuries. Private Thompson and Sergeant Martinez coordinated the effort with military precision, turning their medical station into a vertical rescue operation. Jackson's fighting withdrawal was drawing enemy forces away from the office building, but at a terrible cost in casualties and ammunition. His soldiers were conducting a series of delaying actions through the surrounding industrial complex, buying time with their blood, while hoping that Chen could save the wounded soldiers they were dying to protect. Radio contact confirmed that rescue helicopters were repositioning for a rooftop extraction attempt. Chen reached the office building's roof with her 6 wounded soldiers, just as enemy forces discovered their escape route. Machine gun fire from surrounding buildings made the rooftop a deadly open space, but rescue helicopters were already approaching through the dawn sky. She had to choose between exposing her patients to enemy fire or keeping them trapped in the building where they would certainly be captured or killed. The wounded soldiers made the choice for her, insisting that they would rather die fighting in the open than surrender to enemy torture. Chen helped them establish defensive positions on the rooftop, while enemy bullets sparked off concrete barriers and metal ventilation equipment. Their ammunition was nearly gone, but their determination remained absolute as rescue helicopters approached through concentrated ground fire. Enemy fighters burst onto the rooftop just as the first rescue helicopter began its landing approach. Chen found herself in the center of a firefight while trying to load wounded soldiers into the aircraft under intense enemy pressure. Bullets shattered the helicopter's windows and damaged its engines. But the crew continued the evacuation with heroic determination that matched her own throughout the long night. Sergeant Martinez was hit again while helping load Private Thompson into the helicopter, his body shielding his wounded comrade from enemy fire at the cost of his own life. Chen tried desperately to save him, but his injuries were too severe for field treatment. His final words were instructions for caring for the other wounded soldiers, maintaining his leadership responsibilities, even as he died in her arms. The first helicopter managed to evacuate 4 wounded soldiers before enemy fire forced it to retreat with critical damage to its flight systems. Chen remained on the rooftop with the 2 most severely injured soldiers, knowing that another rescue attempt was unlikely given the intensity of enemy resistance. She had saved most of her patients, but the mission's success remained uncertain as enemy forces closed in around their position. Jackson's mobile unit was completely surrounded in the industrial complex, cut off from retreat and running on their final magazines of ammunition. Radio contact with Chen confirmed that most of the wounded had been evacuated, but she remained trapped on the rooftop with 2 soldiers too injured to move. His sacrifice had succeeded in saving lives, but at a cost that would haunt him for the rest of his military career. As the sun rose fully above the industrial landscape, Chen prepared for what seemed like certain death or capture. She had fulfilled her oath as a medic by saving the majority of her patients, but the 2 soldiers remaining with her needed continued medical care that she could only provide by staying with them. Her choice between personal survival and professional duty had been made hours ago, and she faced the consequences with quiet courage that defined her character throughout the entire ordeal. The second rescue helicopter appeared through the morning haze just as enemy forces reached the rooftop access door. Chen had positioned herself between the 2 remaining wounded soldiers and the approaching enemies, her sidearm ready despite knowing that resistance was futile against overwhelming numbers. The helicopter crew, witnessing her desperate situation, made an incredible decision to attempt extraction despite the deadly ground fire that had damaged the previous aircraft. Private Collins and Corporal Davis, the 2 soldiers remaining with Chen, were both unconscious from blood loss and shock. She had used the last of her medical supplies to keep them stable, but they needed immediate hospital treatment to survive the next few hours. The approaching helicopter represented their only hope, but landing under such intense enemy fire seemed impossible, even for the most skilled pilots. Enemy fighters emerged onto the rooftop firing automatic weapons, while the rescue helicopter hovered overhead, its crew chief lowering rescue cables despite bullets striking the aircraft's fuselage. Chen made split-second decisions that would define the rest of her life, choosing which wounded soldier to send up first while using her own body as a human shield against enemy fire. Her medical training had never prepared her for this moment, but her courage proved equal to the challenge. The helicopter's engines screamed under the strain of maintaining position while taking damage from concentrated ground fire. Chen managed to secure Private Collins to the rescue cable just as enemy fighters closed to within yards of her position. The crew chief provided covering fire with his mounted machine gun, but the aircraft's fuel systems had been hit and were leaking precious aviation fuel across the rooftop in volatile streams. Corporal Davis regained consciousness as Chen prepared him for evacuation, his eyes focusing on her face with recognition and gratitude. Despite his severe injuries, he tried to refuse rescue and insisted that she escape first, embodying the brotherhood that had sustained their unit throughout the terrible night. Chen ignored his protests and secured him to the second rescue cable, while enemy bullets shattered concrete around their position. The helicopter crew made an extraordinary decision to remain in position despite critical damage to their aircraft and imminent fuel exhaustion. They had witnessed Chen's heroism throughout the evacuation and were determined to save the medic who had risked everything for her patients. Their courage under fire matched her own dedication to the wounded soldiers who depended on her medical skills for survival. Jackson's voice crackled over the tactical radio from his surrounded position in the industrial complex, confirming that enemy reinforcements were closing in on the office building. He ordered Chen to evacuate immediately, but she refused to abandon her position until both wounded soldiers were safely aboard the rescue helicopter. Her professional oath as a medic superseded military orders when the lives of her patients were at stake. Enemy fighters reached Chen's position just as the second wounded soldier was lifted to safety, their weapons trained on her from point-blank range. The helicopter crew chief continued providing covering fire despite his aircraft's critical condition, but his ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the damaged engines were beginning to fail. Chen faced the moment of truth that would determine whether her heroic efforts had been sufficient to save her patients. The helicopter's fuel leak had created a dangerous situation as aviation fuel vapors mixed with sparks from damaged electrical systems. Chen realized that the aircraft could explode at any moment, killing everyone aboard, including the wounded soldiers she had fought so hard to save. She made one final heroic decision, using a white phosphorus grenade from her equipment to create a smokescreen that allowed the helicopter to escape, while exposing herself to certain capture. Jackson witnessed the helicopter's escape through his tactical binoculars, confirming that Chen had successfully evacuated all of her wounded soldiers despite overwhelming enemy pressure. Her sacrifice had saved lives that would have been lost without her courage and medical expertise, but his heart broke as he watched enemy fighters surround his medic on the rooftop. The mission's success was measured in the lives she had preserved, through her heroic actions. The rescue helicopter managed to reach friendly territory despite critical damage, delivering Chen's patients to medical facilities where their lives could be saved through proper treatment. Her field medical work had kept them alive long enough for definitive care, fulfilling her oath as a medic even though she remained in enemy hands. The wounded soldiers would carry scars from their ordeal, but they would survive because of her dedication and skill.